And we are live. So welcome to our final installment in our summer series. Today, we're talking about supporter motivation. Of course, many topics in this course have addressed the concept of motivation. Today, we're going to talk about motivation in a more direct way, and we're going to be sharing some of our ideas and frameworks, which we've been using for a while now with meaningful success, and we hope you find it really interesting. If I haven't met some of you before, perhaps a brief introduction is in order. My name is Stefano Di Domenico. I'm a Donor Voices Director of Supporter Motivation. And I also worked as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I'm a psychologist. If you're curious, you can learn about my research by checking out my Google profile. I particularly recommend one of my papers, The Emerging Neuroscience of Intrinsic Motivation. That's related to what we'll be talking about today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me via email, in addition to asking questions in our Q&A. I'm always happy to engage with people in the topic of motivation and fundraising, so that's good. A brief overview of today. Today, we're going to talk about motivation in a way that may be a little different than what at least some of you are accustomed with. We'll be talking about different qualities of motivation and how qualities of supporter motivation are very important, and in fact, more important than the quantity of motivation. Typically, when fundraisers and other applied practitioners address motivation, they're primarily interested in the quantity of motivation. I want to share with you a framework that helps you think about motivation in terms of its varied qualities. And I hope to convince you with data and with theory that the quality of motivation is very important. So I'll introduce the distinction between volitional and controlled motivation. I'm going to talk briefly about a particular situation called reactance, which is something that we want to avoid. And once we have the language for parsing motivation, the question becomes, well, how do we optimize motivation? How do we foster more optimal qualities of donor motivation? What can we do? And the answer is going to be support donors and prospective donors' basic psychological needs. We'll talk about what basic psychological needs are. We'll talk about the specific psychological needs. They are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. We'll delve into those. And in addition to fostering optimal qualities of motivation, we're going to see how basic psychological needs are a framework for addressing other important challenges that fundraisers need to address. We'll talk about needs as a way of recasting the concept of satisfaction. What does it mean for a donor to be satisfied? And we'll touch on the implications of basic psychological needs and motivation for how canvassing and telemarketing teams, the way they work, how those can be optimized. But I want to start. I'm a behavioral scientist, so I think about issues in terms of cause and effect. I try to understand the causes, and I try to understand the causes to get the desired effects, the effects that fundraisers want, the effects that we as an agency want. So cause and effect. Well, this is a cause, right? The attitude, the approach that organizations, that consultants and fundraisers have toward their donors is a cause. And it's a cause that can have an effect on donors' quality of experience and motivation. So you sometimes hear statements like, when it comes to developing appeals, that fundraisers should tug on their donors' heartstrings, or that we want donors to feel like giving will bring them closer to God's heart. This is in the context of a religious charity. We want donors to give. We want to make donors uncomfortable so that they're motivated to give as a means of obtaining relief from that emotional discomfort that we produce. So this is the mindset that some organizations and some consultants have when it comes to messaging donors. And we should look at the effects. We should consider the effects, and we can do so by considering what donors say. In their own words, we recommend that fundraisers obtain open text feedback from their donors. It's often a treasure trove of insight. And what do donors say? Well, when they complain, this is a very common theme. Don't be pushy and manipulative. Accept no for an answer. I felt very pressured to donate. The representative assumed I would donate and wouldn't let me say no. Don't be so persistent and guilt trip the customer. So these are common complaints. I promise if you were to obtain open text comments from your donors, you would see a lot of this, unfortunately. This is so common that if you go on the internet and search for fundraising memes, this comes up, right? So this is a reference on the left to that famous television show, Game of Thrones. Brace yourselves. It's not winter that's coming. It's the guilt-tripping, crying African children Christian charity commercials that are coming, right? And it's no wonder because some ads certainly do seem to be crafted with the intent to produce guilt, to induce pressure, as a means to increase motivation for giving. I hope you have the intuition at this point that this is a suboptimal way to go about messaging donors. We want donors to be motivated. We want donors to care, but we want a particular quality of care because, as we're going to see, and as you probably already intuit, the quality of motivation has implications for how much donors give and, maybe more importantly, how long they stay with you, how committed they become, how well they internalize the charity's cause. And so this is a framework for conceptualizing motivation. This is a framework that's based on more than 40 years of research in motivational science. And according to this framework, there's three broad categories of motivation quality. So on the one hand, you can have a lack of motivation, right? People can be amotivated. They have a lack of motivation. And people have a lack of motivation when there's no value or relevance for doing an activity. If we just consider for a moment, a step outside of fundraising and consider a high school student. A high school student may have no motivation for doing their homework because they see no value or personal relevance. And similarly, a donor or prospective donor can lose motivation or never develop motivation because the act of giving is not personally meaningful. They don't see a value behind the cause. And if they give, and sometimes people do give when they're amotivated, the decision is really random. If you were to ask them why they gave, they would say, well, I don't know, it was an impulsive decision. I gave, but there's really no point in me giving. So obviously that's a low quality of motivation. That's the lack of motivation. Interestingly, people can be motivated in different ways. So people can be motivated because they have a genuine interest in a charitable cause, or they can attach personal value to a cause. They can give because they want to give. They grasp the underlying purpose and they have a volitional quality of motivation as a consequence. They want to give. The opposite of that would be feeling controlled. And donors are controlled when they feel pressured, when they feel guilted, when they feel like they have to give, when they feel that they cannot say no to a canvasser, to a telemarketer. That's controlled motivation. So 3 broad buckets: a lack of motivation, controlled motivation, and volitional motivation. Volitional motivation is the most optimal quality of motivation. Someone who's controlled may give to a cause, but they're ambivalent and their giving is likely to stop at some point very soon. So controlled motivation will be sustained so long as the pressure behind it is sustained. Well, what happens if we're after a monthly gift, if the charitable cause requires sustained support? Things become more difficult. That's where volitional motivation is very useful. Someone who's committed, who has internalized the value behind a charitable cause is much more likely to stay. So those are the 3 broad categories. They can be further detailed as they are in this image here. So controlled motivation, there's actually 2 types of controlled motivation. People can be controlled for external reasons. So they may be seduced or compelled into giving by the promise of obtaining some reward. So give today and get this free hat, right? Or give today and we will approve of you socially. This is one mechanism that can be very pressuring, is the provision of social approval, obtaining others' approval. And sometimes fundraisers inadvertently convey some contingency of worth. If you give, I'm going to judge you as a good person. If you don't, you're a bad person. That's external regulation. So you're motivated for external reasons. Introjected motivation involves the feeling, the internal pressure. I give because I feel I should, to be a good person. A good person gives to charity. If I don't give, I'm a bad person. When I give, my self-esteem goes higher. Those are internal pressures, and internal though they may be, because they have this pressuring quality, they are experienced as controlling. Volitional motivation involves the internalization of a goal. So I give because I consciously value this charitable cause. This charity is addressing a need that I understand, that I think is important, that I want to help address. That's internalization. And we say that people begin to identify with the goal, or they integrate the goal with their other values. And that's a quality of, that's volitional motivation. And when it comes to intrinsic motivation, you may have heard the term intrinsic motivation before. If you're attending this seminar, my guess is that you have interest in psychology and behavioral science concepts. Intrinsic motivation means the experience of doing an activity for the activity's own sake. And when you do an activity for its own sake, it comes with interest and enjoyment. The activity is its own reward. And we do see intrinsic motivation, particularly around volunteer opportunities. So some people volunteer for charitable work because they find it fun. They find it interesting. That would be an example of intrinsic motivation. So that's the framework, that's the nomenclature. One question is, how do we measure these types of motivation? So we at Donor Voice have our own proprietary scale. We call it the donor experience of motivation. And there's multiple ways of measuring motivation. You can use a long scale, which we do on some occasions, but you can also measure motivation quality with a very brief instrument. So here is an example of a 2-item instrument. This is personally important or enjoyable. I do it because I want to. That's addressing volitional motivation. I feel pressure to do it. That's the controlled motivation. More detailed scales allow for a more precise measurement of the distinct qualities of motivation, and those are sometimes important to measure. But you can still measure the broad quality of motivation with as few as 2 items. We try to measure motivation as close as possible to a meaningful point of interaction. So we do it immediately or close to immediately after face-to-face interactions, after telemarketing discussions, over digital channels, and direct mail. These items, as you can see, they have a feel like typical satisfaction items, measures. So, they're not too foreign. And of course, we recommend that you want to obtain high quality data. And the way you do that is by telling your donors and your prospective donors that their data is protected. You explain the rationale behind the data collection. We're measuring motivation to make sure that we're delivering a high quality of experience for our donors. And that's a typical rationale. Okay, so do these qualities of motivation predict important donor outcomes? The answer is yes. So in 2000, last summer, we ran an insight study with a number of organizations. This is data from an animal rights group. And what we have here on this table is volitional qualities of motivation, suboptimal qualities of motivation, averaging, the amotivation, external and introjection. And what you see, I want to just draw your attention to the commitment score. What you see is that the donors who are more who had a higher quality of volitional motivation, well, their commitment level was higher. And their overall lifetime giving was 37% higher. That's an animal rights group. This is an environmental group. Again, higher levels of commitment and overall more lifetime giving. And finally, this is a health charity. Again, higher levels of commitment, and the lifetime giving was, in this particular case, more than 100% greater. So we see this again and again across a variety of different fundraising sectors. We see that more volitional qualities of motivation truly are more effective, the more effective type of motivation. And we really want to foster those volitional types of motivation. And so in the rest of this presentation, I want to hopefully I've convinced you that the quality of motivation matters. And I want to now focus on how we can foster these more optimal volitional types of motivation. Before I do that though, I want to touch on that topic, that concept of psychological reactance. Reactance, I promise you, is something that your canvassing and telemarketing team are intimately familiar with. Reactance is having the door slammed in your face or having the phone hung up on you. And reactance is the experience that a donor or prospective donor feels when they're rebelling against you. They feel pressured, they don't want to be on the phone, they feel like they're being harassed, they get angry, and they do the exact opposite of what you want, of what you hope they do. And so this is a particular type of controlled motivation. When people feel pressured, they either comply, or they lash out. Reactance is lashing out. And this is bad for the charity, for the brand. And it's also harsh on your canvassing team, on the telemarketing team. We want to avoid this. So this is an interesting study showing you the power of reactance and why we should avoid it. These were two brochures. This is a study on how to message people to reduce prejudice. So in this study, university participants, they saw one of two brochures. There was a need-supportive brochure, which we're going to talk about in more detail, and there was a controlling brochure. And both brochures were about reducing prejudice, but the quality of motivation that they fostered was obviously different. So in the need-supportive brochure, people were told, you are free to choose to value a non-prejudice. Only you can decide, non-pressuring. It's a personal choice to be non-prejudiced. In the controlling brochure, the participants were told, you should be less prejudiced. You should refrain. It's the politically and socially correct thing to do. Society demands it. So participants saw both of these brochures, and then afterward, their levels of prejudice were measured. Well, people in the need-supportive brochure, that's the autonomy brochure, they had the lowest levels of prejudice. Some participants received no brochure, right? So they just did some other irrelevant task, and then their level of prejudice was measured. And finally, in the controlling brochure, we had the highest levels of prejudice. So what's going on? This is reactance. This is an example of people doing the exact opposite of what you hope to do when you stoke that pressuring feeling inside of them. They can sometimes lash out in the opposite direction. We obviously want to avoid that. Okay, so how do we support more volitional qualities of motivation? How do we get away from that bad stuff? The answer is we support donors' basic psychological needs. This is the model that I hope summarizes this nicely for you. When we satisfy people's donors' psychological needs, they develop higher volitional motivation, and that leads to more giving and less attrition. So what are the psychological needs? There are three psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy means having the experience of meaningful choice. People are autonomous when they can endorse their actions, when they can stand behind their own decisions. That's autonomy. And giving people the opportunity to exercise choice and volition is an autonomy supportive context. Competence means feeling like you're able to produce positive outcomes in the environment. In fundraising, that very often means seeing the positive difference that your gift is making on the world. And then finally, relatedness means having a meaningful sense of social connection with others. That could be with the beneficiary of the charity. And it can mean feeling like you belong to the fundraising effort. You feel like you're part of something greater. Feel like you are part of a community. And so these are the three psychological needs. And when donors have these needs satisfied, volitional qualities of motivation ensue. So charities are generally fairly good at fostering a high level of relatedness, but there's always room for improvement. So some ways to ensure your group is fostering a sense of relatedness is to show genuine interest in your donors. Make them feel like they matter as donors. They're not just, that they matter as people. They're not just donors with a dollar sign. They have thoughts, they have perceptions, they have ideas, and you're interested in learning about those, and try to show interest when you can. Donors sometimes have a conflict when it comes to giving money. Money is a sensitive topic for many people. And so asking for money can rouse ambivalence. Sometimes the knee-jerk reaction is to try to avoid a donor expressing ambivalence. You want to snuff out that conversation, right? Avoid the topic. A more relatedness supportive strategy would be to allow for donors to express their ambivalence, try to understand it, welcome it even. And when you do that, well, what you're doing is you're having a meaningful interaction with your donor, and that fosters relatedness. Obviously, we don't want to be pushy, we don't want to be disrespectful in any way, and we don't want to make them feel bad. We don't want them to have the sense that they're good people, we approve, they belong when they give, they don't when they don't give. That would be low relatedness. Showing interest in your donors, you can get very creative about this, right? So in some of our scripts, this is a telemarketing example, we bake into the script questions that get the donor to engage and share their information. So this is a work with a Canadian organization. People support the group for a variety, this charity for a variety of reasons. Which is most important to you? Is it the domestic emergency response, the first aid response? Which is it? They give their answer, and then you can reflect back. Oh, yes, that is a very important piece of work that we do. So there's certainly opportunities to get very creative with fostering relatedness, as there is for all the needs. High autonomy. So you foster autonomy when you attempt to discover the donor's frame of reference. You allow their initiation, welcome the questions, let them voice their concerns, especially their concerns. When you make a request, or when there's some type of restriction, for example, if a donor wants to give for only, if you're asking for monthly gifts and the donor is asking for only one-time gifts, and your group can only accommodate monthly gifts, you can give a meaningful rationale behind that restriction so that they don't feel like the choice is being pulled under their feet, right? The rug isn't pulled beneath their feet. Meaningful rationales are helpful for donors. And giving choice, obviously, is a great way to foster autonomy, but the choices have to be meaningful, right? You can imagine if there's 3 different monthly giving options, $10, $11, and $13, well, those aren't really meaningfully different from each other. But if the choices are $10, $50, and $100, well, those differences are more meaningful. So giving choice is good, but it's not so much the number of choice options that matters. It's what's much more important is the meaningfulness of the choices. You don't want to exert pressure. You don't want to be judgmental. And of course, we don't want to manipulate donors with incentives or premiums that have the flavor of, I'm shining this shiny object in front of you and hopefully it gets you to reach out and give. Rewards, when they're given, are best given as symbolic gestures of appreciation. When rewards are offered up to seduce donors, then that creates a feeling of being manipulated. That's low autonomy. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So, as I was saying, sometimes an organization's internal processes can stand in the way of fostering autonomy. Common scenario, I want to give a one-time gift. We only accept monthly gifts. hopefully this interaction in the cartoon did not end like this. Hopefully the canvasser was able to explain why monthly gifts are the only types of gifts that can be accommodated. And donors really do appreciate that, because people, of course, value their money. And when they have the initiation to give, if there's a restriction to that, they would clearly benefit by understanding why such a restriction exists. And so that leaves them with a sense of that interaction was satisfying. I learned something about how fundraisers operate at the very least, right? Autonomy, supporting people's autonomy, one way to do that is by asking about their preferences and how you communicate with them. You can directly ask them and then tailor your donor journeys accordingly. So this is an example. How would you like to hear from this group? How often? Once a week, once a month, once a year, right? Have donors choose and try to fulfill their request. And so, again, opportunities to get creative. Premiums and gifts. This is, I already mentioned this, but it's worth going over again. Sometimes there's the temptation to offer a gift as a means to stoke donors' motivation. Gifts can produce motivation, but what happens when the gifts stop coming, the giving stops as well, because that's a controlled type of motivation. It's external motivation. We want volitional motivation that begins from the donor. And so gifts are tricky. We recommend that when you use a gift, the gift should be used as a token of appreciation. It shouldn't be the most salient reason for giving. It should be kind of an unexpected bonus. That helps reduce the possibility that the gift is experienced as autonomy thwarting. And finally, competence. Competence, some fundraisers use the word impact, donor impact, to get at the concept of competence. And so it's not altogether an unfamiliar term or notion, but how do you foster competence? Well, one way to do so, some donors can only give a little bit, right? They can only give a modest amount. Well, one way to foster competence is by explaining how even a small amount can be very helpful. When people have a challenge in front of them, if that challenge is seen as overwhelming, then there's a low sense of competence, right? But if they feel that the challenge is attainable, the challenge can be surmounted, then that fosters a sense of competence, that energized, repetitive, I can do this, we can reach this goal, that sense of progress. And so, for example, if we're talking about feeding children in poor parts of the world, you wouldn't say feed Africa. That's too overwhelming, it's vague. But you could say something more specific, like provide healthy meals to children in this village who are facing this disaster, right? That would be more specific, more pinpointed, and as a goal, it's much more attainable. And when we give feedback, we want the feedback to be very specific. We want the feedback to be cause specific. Sometimes that means sharing statistics. What's important about the statistics, the most important thing is that they're understandable. So we're not opposed to sharing statistics, but the statistics that we share ought to be easily understood. We don't want donors to feel helpless. So with all of these needs, with all three needs, there's the things that we can do and the things that we should avoid, right? And sometimes it's hard to do what will foster the need for a variety of reasons, but we should always try to minimize thwarting the need. And so one thing you definitely don't want to do to satisfy competence is to say things that make donors feel helpless. So one thing that makes donors feel helpless is the notion of constantly increasing need. Sharing numbers and statistics can be very numbing. So again, they can be a means for giving competence feedback, but you need to be very careful. We recommend that the statistics get trialed and focus grouped if possible, to make sure that people understand and that people don't feel overwhelmed. If you're asking for repeated gifts, then the onus is on the charity to show ongoing progress. That makes sense, because people will want to give volitionally when they have that sense of making meaningful progress toward a goal. And so we have to show that meaningful progress. And most charities do a very good job of this, but there's room for improvement here as well. So here's an example of a study that we did a while back on competence and repeated giving. So we had, this was an appeal for fostering children. In the control appeal, there was not much information regarding competence, but in the competence feedback appeal, there was an infographic that explained how hunger was reduced in clear terms. And that resulted in 20% more conversions, greater revenue, and a larger average gift. So even a small piece of information can make the difference for delivering that sense of competence for donors. Here are a few examples of need thwarting appeals. He's so sick, he could die before you've even read your morning paper. That's obviously pressuring, controlling. This is a meme, but it gets to the point, right? Without your gift, this puppy will die. Just to drive home the point, some examples of need thwarting appeals. And here are some examples of need supportive appeals, right? So this is an example of a child now having clean running water. Because of your gift, now they have fresh water, right? That's competence feedback. It's directly showing you the result. It's visually showing the clean water that they now have. The image is pleasant. The child is looking straight. In the picture, it visually is very socially connecting. So that's good. This is Ronald McDonald House. They do a fairly good job of having need supportive appeal. So Ronald McDonald House, they offer families who have loved ones in the hospital with overnight accommodations. And they do a really good job of explaining why the accommodations are important, how they help families, and they have these really affirming, they typically have affirming imagery behind the appeal. So I recommend you would check them out as a source of inspiration for need supporting appeals. They're generally pretty good. I told you earlier on that need support results in more volitional qualities of motivation. Here are some data backing that up. So again, this is results from that 2020 discovery project that we did with a variety of charities. This is data from a health charity, but I promise you similar, if not identical, results were obtained for a variety of different groups. What we see is the greater autonomy, competence, and relatedness donors reported experiencing in their interactions with the charity, the higher their levels of volitional motivation. And so the surefire way to foster volitional motivation is by making sure you satisfy your donor's psychological needs. Psychological needs are also important and useful for understanding what can be the vague notion of donor satisfaction, right? Charities and agencies often ask their donors how satisfied they are. It could be satisfied with the charity itself, with some particular program. The problem with satisfaction measures is if a donor says they are very satisfied, you're not entirely sure why they're satisfied. And similarly, if they say they're dissatisfied, again, you don't really know why they're dissatisfied. But if you ask donors to rate their level of satisfaction for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, right, then when they say they're satisfied, you know exactly where they're satisfied. And if they're dissatisfied, well, you know what to improve. A donor said they felt they were being manipulated. Well, that means we should change something about the way we're messaging donors. If they say they have low competence, well, we need to give more positive feedback about what we're doing. And the great thing is you can then take a remedial course of action that's personalized to your donors, right? So the fundraiser was too pushy. You can respond back, I'm concerned that you felt pressured. You can imagine this is a telemarketing conversation or even an email. Please accept our apologies. You're apologizing, not in the general, but the apology is meaningful because you're addressing what they complained about specifically. And these needs, because they're basic psychological needs, they pretty much cover the universe of experiences donors can have in general enough terms, right? So there's 3 categories, there's 3 dimensions to the donor experience. You're measuring all 3 when you examine the psychological needs. And so you're well equipped to produce remedial action. We're close to running out of time, so just briefly, the goal is to interact with donors in a way that supports their satisfaction of the needs. That might mean that canvassing teams and telemarketing teams need to be educated about some of the strategies I shared with you today about how to satisfy the needs. For some members of your canvassing team and telemarketing team, that might be something new, right? Because some canvassers and telemarketers have a sales background and they think of canvassing like sales, and salesmanship is often high pressuring. You want them to buy, sign on the line that's dotted. That produces a pressuring, need thwarting context that results in the controlled type of motivation that results in the reactance. We don't want that. So education is key. Another thing is being evaluated, how rendered they're being held to. So one strategy that's benefited some of the teams that we've worked with is shifting the goal from the number of signups to assessing the quality of the interactions with the prospective donors. And how do you measure the quality of interaction? Well, you measure the donor psychological need satisfaction. And so a high performing canvasser, for example, would be one that is able to foster those need satisfied states in the donors. So that's one other important element to all this. And then finally, you may consider using personality screening tools in designing your hiring process. So there are particular personality traits that you can hire for or screen for. Agreeable and extroverted people, so people who are naturally sociable and polite and compassionate, they tend to be temperamentally well-suited. They have a facility with fostering need satisfaction in others. And so we recommend that you try to hire for people who are more agreeable and extroverted. So I ran a little bit over, so thank you. I'm going to try to take some questions. I'm going to stop my screen share. And I'll try to address any questions if there are any. So Tina asks, are donors with commitment level of 5 or less likely to respond to volitional motivation, or more likely to respond to controlled motivation than donors with donors with commitment level 9? Or is volitional motivation preferred regardless of commitment level of donor? Yes, so thanks for the question, Tina. The data suggests that the quality of motivation comes before the level of commitment. What drives commitment is their quality of motivation. And again, that's because when people are volitionally motivated, they're internalizing the goal of the charity. They're aligning with the cause. They see the cause as a personal cause, as a cause that they share. And that's essentially commitment. And so motivation is the first thing in that causal sequence. So we want to always foster high volitional motivation, and high volitional motivation is always associated with higher levels of commitment. Commitment, you will be extremely hard pressed to ever find someone who says that they're committed to a charity but has a controlled quality of motivation. They're very, very highly correlated. And so strategically, you focus on fostering satisfaction of basic psychological needs to foster volitional motivation to in turn produce the commitment. I hope that answers the question. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, please feel free to email me. Again, I like to geek out over this stuff, so I'm always happy to engage with all of you about this. I hope you found it informative, and I hope to meet you all at some point. Thank you very much.